Hi everyone, I'm Max Panola. I'm the ESG lead at Envision Blockchain, and today we're going to be going over how to create a policy in the Guardian based on a standard. And we're going to go through that process with the VCS Red policy. The VCS standard is the Verified Carbon Standard. It's the leading offset standard for validating and verifying greenhouse gas reductions. And it consists of a registry system that records the life cycle of the assets, which are VCUs, verified carbon units. Each verified carbon unit represents 1 metric ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And it also involves independent auditing from VVBs, validation and verification bodies. And it also publishes approved accounting methodologies for different project types. Red Plus is a project type. It stands for reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. There are various types of red projects, but for this presentation, we're going to be dealing with avoiding planned deforestation. So the general steps you want to follow to create a policy in the Guardian is first to identify the standard that you want to create in the Guardian. For this presentation, we're going to be going over the Verra VCS standard version 4.2. It's important to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date version of the standard. And the methodology that we're going to be using under that standard is the Red Plus methodology, version 1.6. Once you know the standard and the methodology that you're going to be using, you're going to want to review the documents associated with that standard and that methodology, and also pay close attention to other documents that may be referred to within those documents. For example, for Red Plus, there's a main framework, but there's also different modules that are to be applied based on the context of the project. And we'll go over that in the next slide. And then as you're going through this documentation, you want to be identifying roles, processes, data inputs and parameters, and calculation methodologies. Those are the four aspects that you want to be paying close attention to and collecting requirements for. So to visualize that process, you want to be mapping out the roles and process steps, and that will create the workflow. And the data parameters and calculation methodologies are going to be used to create the schema. The general workflow for a Red Apd project is generally starts with the creation of the project description, which is to be submitted to Verra. Verra will add it to the project pipeline along with the documentation to the registry. The project proponent will then contract a VVB, and the VVB will assess and validate the project, basically validating that the project activities and details are in alignment with the VCS standard and the Red methodology. From there, the project proponent will conduct monitoring and then submit a monitoring report to the VVB. The VVB will then verify the monitoring report and the calculations within the monitoring report, which will determine how many VCUs are to be issued. And the VCU issuance request is submitted to Verra. Then VCUs are issued, recorded in the registry, and they can then be traded or they can be retired. Retiring them can help entities reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. For the Red Plus methodology, there's the main framework that we discussed, and then there's also other methodologies that are referred to that outline additional requirements, calculation methodologies, parameters. Think of them as sort of subsets of the main methodology, and collectively those will create a modulated methodology. And generally, emissions are calculated based on estimating and quantifying the baseline emissions, which are the emissions that would have occurred in the absence of the project activities, the project emissions, which are the emissions that would occur with the project emissions, and then leakage, which is emissions that could occur as a result of the project activities, but outside the project boundary. For example, if an area is protected from deforestation, deforestation could actually increase outside of the project area to meet demand for forest products. Once you have these three items, you have collectively the summary of net GHG emissions as a result of the project. And then there's a buffer credit calculation as well, because land use projects have a risk of reversal, which could happen from, for example, a forest fire. And then there's also a certain degree of uncertainty. So these three are estimated, and that's what goes into the VCU calculation. And then here we have the actual VCU calculation equation. So now to sort of go over how we used that process to develop the schema. So this is the general outline of the schema. And these are the general inputs and parameters that are going to go into both the project activity and the monitoring report. Some of them are general details of the project, the methodologies and modules used, description of the project area. But very importantly, if you scroll down, we go over exactly how VCUs are calculated for these types of projects, the inputs that are required. So let's take a look at the baseline scenario real quick. Basically, you're going to be calculating the amount of deforestation that is going to be occurring in the baseline scenario in the absence of the project activity, and the changes in carbon stocks that will that are estimated to occur in the absence of the project activity, and then the net baseline emissions calculated here, which is based on these carbon stock changes as well as some non-CO2 GHG emissions. In this case, are going to be mostly from the burning of biomass, but different project scenarios will have different sources. But and then in the project scenario, the net project GHG emissions will be based on carbon stock changes from deforestation in the project area, net changes from degradation, and changes from natural disturbance, as well as project non-CO2 GHG emissions, the sum of those. And another thing to note, what we did here, these items in green are auto-calculated fields. So a lot of these inputs and parameters are actually can be calculated based on other inputs and parameters. So in order to reduce the burden on the project proponent, we've reduced the amount of inputs and allowed some of these very important parameters to be auto-calculated. And then when you go to calculate the VCUs, it'll be the pooled buffer count contribution, which is based on the AFOLU risk rating, which basically calculates or estimates the risk of reversal. And then it's adjusted for uncertainty. And the net GHG removals being a result of the net project of the baseline emissions minus the project emissions minus the calculated leakage. And that in a nutshell is how we identify the parameters and inputs that go into calculating VCUs so that they can be tokenized through the Guardian. And now I'll kick it off to Dan to explain some of the more technical aspects.
Thanks, Max. So after the policy is created that matches the workflow Max just explained, we're going to log out of Verra, which is the root authority, and we're going to log in as the VVB. And what we're going to do now is we're going to establish the role of that user as the VVB, and we're going to enter a name for the VVB. We will now log back in as the root authority, Verra in this case. We're going to go ahead and approve the VVB. We will now log in as the project proponent. Again, this is one of the actors of the workflow, and we're going to register the user with that role. The project proponent will need to create a new project and will detail everything about that project. Once filled out and submitted, you'll notice that the status is waiting to be added. We can see here all the calculations of the VCUs that will be issued after verification and validation. We will now log back into the Verra account and go into the Project Pipelines tab. The new project has been populated, and we can now officially add it to the project pipeline. We now go into the project proponent account, and now the next step of the workflow is to select a Verra approved VVB to perform the verification and validation of this project. Now going into the VVB account, you can see that the project is now populated. The VVB can review the information and validate the project. After the project has been validated, we will go into the project proponents account, and now we can submit the monitoring report. After the project proponent has submitted their monitoring report, the VVB can now go into the Monitoring Report tab, select the project, review the monitoring report, and verify it. Once the verification has been completed by the VVB, we will go into the Verra account, and in the Monitoring Report tab, you will see the monitoring report has a status of verified. Verra can, of course, review the monitoring report. Once ready, they can then press the Mint button to begin the minting process of the VCUs. Once the minting is complete, you can view the trust chain to see an audit trail of everything we just discussed. To call out a few things that you will see in the trust chain, you'll see the verifiable credentials that relate to the policy creation. You'll also see the verifiable credentials that relate to the validation report, along with the verification reports. You'll also see verifiable credentials that show all the VCUs that were minted. As a last step, what we could do is head over to the project proponents account, and we could see all 387,000 VCUs that were minted and then transferred to their account.